Welcome to Episode 2 of the Objective Epistemology podcast. If you missed Episode 1, I read and comment on an article that attempts to indoctrinate you into a critical Marxist conscientization or mindset by pretending that there can be multiple ways of knowing. Don't worry, you don't need to listen to the first podcast to understand the second podcast, but it will provide a little more context to why I'm making the second podcast. In Episode 2, I will be reading and commenting on the first chapter of a book titled Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, written by Ayn Rand, the writer and philosopher. I admire her work, and since I've never gotten a chance to meet her, I can't comment on her as a person from personal experience, though from what I read about her as a person leads me to think that I wouldn't have chosen her as a friend, but would have enjoyed sitting down and discussing philosophy with her. Let's get started. Imagine, for just a moment, that your mind has yet to be formed. Imagine that you have no inner monologue, no inner thoughts about anything. Now imagine you're floating in the void of space in some remote region where there is only darkness. One day, off in the distance, you become alert to a change. This change is another object, emitting a soft light. At that moment, you become conscious. This is where you first realize that you are not that other object emitting the soft light, that you are your own entity, and that you are observing another object, and that object is its own entity, separate from you. This is the beginning of how thinking or cognition starts, through the process of differentiation. When you realize that you are a separate object or entity, and that entities exist as separate units, the process of integration, or realizing that different objects can share something in common, a generic name or placeholder called a unit, this is the part of thinking where you realize that two different entities exist and that they are different and separate, but are still units in and of themselves. In the most general sense, both entities exist in reality, and that is at least one thing that they have in common. Chapter 1, Cognition and Measurement, as discovered by Ms. Rand. Consciousness, as a state of awareness, is not a passive state, but an active process that consists of two essentials, differentiation and integration. So, differentiation means the ability to see the difference between two things or units, and why those things or units could be placed in different categories or containers for particular kinds of units. And integration means the ability to find reasons to place things or units together in common categories or containers by identifying similarities between those units. Ms. Rand continues more succinctly by saying, although chronologically man's consciousness develops in three stages, the stage of sensations, perceptual, the conceptual, epistemologically, the base of man's knowledge is the perceptual stage. Chronologically means there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. Chronology is a progression through time. So Ms. Rand observes that thinking goes through three stages. Stage 1 is sensation, process, or perception of our brains realizing that one of our five senses is being activated in a given moment of time. Either you are seeing something, hearing something, feeling something touching your skin, smelling something, tasting something. Stage 2 is what happens instantly as you realize that one or usually more of your sensations are being activated. Consciousness, brain, or thought process asks the question, what is causing the sensation to be activated? This is how you perceive an interaction happening to you in space and time. The third stage is where you're beginning the process of forming a concept. Your mind begins the process of thought through the skill of differentiation and integration, with the goal of transforming entities into new units. Ms. Rand states this more clearly, I think. Sensations, as such, are not retained by man's memory, nor is man able to experience a pure, isolated sensation. As far as can be ascertained, an infant's sensory experience is undifferentiated chaos. Discriminated awareness begins on the level of percepts. A percept is a group of sensations, automatically retained and integrated by the brain of a living organism. It is the form of percepts that man grasps the evidence of his senses and apprehends reality. When we speak of direct perception or direct awareness, we mean the perceptual level. Percepts, not sensations, are the given, the self-evident. The knowledge of sensation as components of perception is not direct. It is acquired by man much later. It is a scientific, conceptual discovery. As I understand Ms. Rand and her words, scientific to mean discovery, and that knowledge is discovered, not created. Before continuing, let's take a quick look at the word implicit. Implicit means the existent or the thing, attribute, or action. Needs to no qualification or question. That is, is absolute. This can happen when someone needs to use the existent or the thing, attribute, or action as the most important part of the argument they intend to use against the existent or the thing, attribute, or action itself in an attempt to disqualify it or disprove it. It's a fool's errand and ends a disgraceful contradiction and logical fallacy. Another word is explicitly, which means in a clear and detailed manner, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. And constituents means parts. Miss Rand continues, the building blocks of man's knowledge is the concept of an existent, of something that exists, be it a thing, an attribute, or an action. Since it is a concept, man cannot grasp it explicitly until he has reached the conceptual stage, but it is implicit in every percept. Perceiving a thing is to perceive that it exists, and man grasps it implicitly on the perceptual level, i.e., or for an example, he grasps the constituents of the concept, existence, the data which are later to be integrated by that concept. It is implicit knowledge that permits his consciousness to develop further. What a baller discovery for sure. The reason the first mind could continue progressing is because the process of discovering an objective epistemology is implicit or self-evident when unmolested by predatory, ideological, cult religious processes like critical Marxism. Let's continue. It may be supposed that the concept existent is implicit, even on the level of sensations, if and to the extent that a consciousness is able to discriminate on that level. A sensation is a sensation of something, as distinguished from the nothing of the preceding and succeeding moments. A sensation does not tell a man what exists, but only that it exists. Like music, sensations are fleeting, lasting only in the momentum of the moment. There can be successions of similar sensational events over a given period of time, but it is our perception of what those sensations actually are that are the most important interludes towards forming concepts or reaching the conceptual level or stage of cognition. Miss Rand continues, the implicit concept existent undergoes 3 stages of development in man's mind. The first stage is a child's awareness of objects, of things which represent the implicit concept entity. The second and closely aligned stage is the awareness of specific particular things which he can recognize and distinguish from the rest of his perceptual field, which represents the implicit concept identity. So through the process of figuring out what the differences are about the things in our field of view, we employ or deploy a skill set of differentiation. We also employ or deploy the actions of figuring out what the similarities are through the skill sets of integration. An individual builds a concept of identity by asking him or herself the question, what is it? Miss Rand continues. Third stage consists of grasping relationships among these entities by grasping their similarities and differences of their identities. This requires the transformation of the implicit concept entity into the implicit concept unit. So breaking this all down through the skill and practice of figuring out what is the same and what is different about objects that exist, people build the concept or idea, the unit, where units can be placed together or be placed separate by the things that make up their identities. Identities being the word used to define objects or entities by their most important parts or actions. Miss Rand states this more clearly. When a child observes that 2 objects, which he will later learn to designate as tables, resemble each other, but are different from 4 other objects, chairs, his mind is focusing on the particular attributes of the objects, their shape, then isolating them according to their differences, and integrating them as units into separate groups, according to their similarities. This is the key, the entrance to the conceptual level of man's consciousness. The ability to regard entities as units is man's distinctive method of cognition, which other living species are unable to follow. This is mostly true. Some species, since this was first written, have been demonstrated to also be able to regard entities as units, but to a significantly lesser degree than humans. For example, members of the Corvus Corvax family. Let's continue. A unit is an existent regarded as a separate member of a group of 2 or more similar members. 2 stones are 2 units, so are 2 square feet of ground, regarded as distinct parts of a conscious, as regarded as distinct parts of a continuous stretch of ground. Note the concept unit involves an act of consciousness, a selective focus, a certain way of regarding things that is not an arbitrary creation of consciousness. It is a method of identification or classification according to the attributes which a consciousness observes in reality. This method permits any number of classifications and cross-classifications. One may classify things according to their shape, color, or weight, or size, or atomic structure, but the criterion of classification is not invented. It is perceived in reality. Thus the concept unit is a bridge between metaphysics and epistemology. Units do not exist qua units. What exists are things. Units are things viewed by a consciousness in certain existing relationships. Are you beginning to observe how an objective epistemology can be discovered and utilized to make decisions about reality and how to live one's life? If not yet, over the next few episodes, I think you will start to identify how, importantly, why. Let's continue. With the grasp of the implicit concept unit, man reaches the conceptual level of cognition, which consists of two interrelated fields, the conceptual and the mathematical. The process of concept formation is, in large part, a mathematical process. Before I continue reading, why is the process of concept formation heavily reliant on mathematics? I have observed two divergent or different groups of mathematicians, those that see math as a means of understanding an objective reality, and those that see mathematics as a theoretical end in itself, where there is no objective reality to be discovered. The first camp are the traders, inventors, the movers and shakers of the world. The second camp are the bringers of conceptual stagnation, with convoluted theories about unknowable reality, the promulgators of all the death cults in history. Miss Rand continues, mathematics is the science of measurement. Before proceeding to the subject of concept formation, let us first consider the subject of measurement. Let's take a moment to define the word quantitative as relating to measuring or measured by the quantity or amount of something rather than its quality. Also, the word concrete, or something that is physically usable or manipulated by an entity or person. Let's continue. Measurement is the identification of a relationship, quantitative relationship established by means of a standard that serves as a unit. Entities and their actions are measured by their attributes, length, weight, velocity, etc. And the standard of measurement is a concretely specified unit representing the appropriate attribute. Thus, one measures length in inches, feet, and miles, weight in pounds, velocity by means of a given distance traversed in a given time, etc. It is important to note that while the choice of a given standard is optional, the mathematical rules of using it are not. It makes no difference whether one measures length in terms of feet or meters. The standard provides only the form of notation, not the substance nor the result of the process of measuring. The facts established by measurement will be the same, regardless of the particular standard used. The standard can neither alter nor affect them. The requirements of a standard of measurement are that it represents the appropriate attributes, that it be easily perceivable by man, and that, once chosen, it remains immutable and absolute whenever used. Please remember this. We will have reason to recall it later. What Miss Rand is stating here is that it doesn't matter if you measure something with a particular stick, rock, woman's arm, or a measuring stick, only that once you define that object as the thing we used to measure stuff, it must remain constant, the same, or absolute. Let's continue. Now, what is the purpose of measurement? Observe that measurement consists of relating an easily perceivable unit to larger or smaller quantities, then to infinitely larger or infinitely smaller quantities, which are not directly perceivable to man. The word infinitely is used here as a mathematical, not a metaphysical term. Purpose of measurement is to expand the range of man's consciousness, of his knowledge, beyond the perceptual level, beyond the direct power of his senses and the immediate concretes of any given moment. Man can perceive the length of 1 foot directly. He cannot perceive 10 miles. By establishing the relationship of feet to miles, he can grasp and know any distance on Earth. By establishing the relationship of miles to light years, he can know the distance of galaxies. When I read this over 20 years ago, it was mind-blowing then. When I read it today, I reminisce of how this particular idea changed the way I see reality. The process of measurement is a process of integrating an unlimited scale of knowledge to man's limited perceptual experience, a process of making the universe knowable by bringing it within the range of man's consciousness, by establishing its relationship to man. It is not an accident that man's early attempts at measurement, the evidence of which survives to this day, consisted of relating things to himself, as, for instance, taking the length of his foot as a standard of length, or adopting the decimal system, which is supposed to have its origin in man's 10 fingers as units of counting. It is here that Pythagoras' old dictum may be given a new meaning, opposite of the one he intended. Man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure, epistemologically, not metaphysically. In regard to human knowledge, man has to be the measure, since he has to bring all things to the realm of the human knowable. In regards to human knowledge, man has to be the measure, since he has to bring all things into the realm of the humanly knowable. But far from leading to subjectivism, the methods which he has to employ require the most rigorous mathematical precision, the most rigorous compliance with objective rules and facts, if the end product is to be knowledge. This is, again, why I adhere to the idea that knowledge is discovered and not created. This is also why there can't be multiple ways of knowing when applied to contradictory and competing truths. Truth comes from the process mentioned in the words I've just spoken. If you are still not convinced, stick around for the rest of the chapters in future episodes. Let's continue. This is true of mathematical principles and the principles by which man forms his concepts. Man's mathematical and conceptual abilities develop simultaneously. The child learns to count when he is learning his first words, and in order to proceed beyond the stage of counting his 10 fingers, it is the conceptual level of his consciousness that man has to expand. Thank you for sticking around to the end and listening to me read and comment about the first chapter of Ayn Rand's book discussing how objective epistemology was discovered. In the next episode, I will be reading and commenting on the second chapter of the Objectivist Epistemology. I'll catch you in the next episode, and don't forget to sub so I can continue making these podcasts.